I remember, I started watching Ethan Van Sciver's Comicsgate, and finding out more about independent comics, finding out about Cyberfrog and all these things, and then all of a sudden, Rippaverse comes along, and I don't know if it was probably through a Bleeding Cool article or something that was talking about how the company is starting up, or if it was through Ethan's broadcast. I want to say he had Eric July on one of his programs in the early days, and we got to learn about this new comic book company that was starting up that was going to have several titles, and it was going to have several different characters. The first character, ISOM, was going to be the launch pad for all of these other characters, including ALPHACORE and YAIRA, and then who knows what else. And that was an exciting thing. It was exciting because most of the independent comic book creators out there are putting together a title. Shane Davis is doing Inglorious Rex, and at some point he might do Starlight Cats, but I don't think the two occupy necessarily the same universe. Ethan Van Sciver's got Cyberfrog. He's going to have some other properties in the Cyberfrog universe, but he's also working on the Rainbow the Brute, which doesn't intersect with that. And he's also got Fearsome that doesn't intersect with that. A lot of comic book creators out there are creating these one-off type properties where the properties don't intersect with one another. They don't form a universe. And there are a lot of people like me who get excited about the idea of a comic book universe. When you have a comic book universe and you have all these different characters who are going to be interacting together and building a history together, and especially in Eric July's presentation of it, where he's saying this is what is lacking from the comic book industry now, is that they're constantly rewriting their own histories. Their characters don't mesh together in any recognizable form. You see contradictions all the time. They don't respect the fans. They don't respect the lore. We're going to do all that. And so when you had somebody like Eric July, who'd made a name for himself in critiquing all of these comics that had been out there, all of these movies that had been out there, all these different comic book properties, and he was going to bring us the kinds of comics and a comic book universe like what we had been longing for a long time. That was exciting. I mean, it was something, and to see him going on all of these different shows. He was on Fox News. He was on the Glenn Beck's program. Of course, he'd already been associated with Glenn Beck at the time, and I think he still is in some degree. But you had him making the rounds and getting all this popularity, and it was all this great big spirit of community that was springing up around the Rippaverse, and we had really, really high hopes for it. We at least hoped that there was going to be a basic level of competence displayed in the book, because here was a guy who had, after all, spent all of this time critiquing comics. Surely, the same level of critique would be leveled upon his own comic when he brought it out into the marketplace. So there was a lot of hype, a lot of understandable. I mean, he built his own website for it, and then the whole crowd. Well, it wasn't a crowdfunding thing; it was a pre-order campaign. Understandably, he funded the project with about $200,000 to $300,000 of his own money, and started this business, hired employees, got the thing going, and when everything was said and done, there were $3.7 million on the table. $3.7 million, which was higher than anybody had managed to raise before for a single comic book. And it was like the crowd went wild. And we were just like, wow. And hopefully this is going to be really, really good stuff. Brian Sunley-Old says, Ethan was promoting the Rippaverse quite a lot, ramping up to book one. Yeah, and understandably so. I mean, it was... with all of the popularity, there was a real chance of riding on the Rippaverse's coattails and getting more exposure for your own comic. Now, that turned out to be something that Eric did not really necessarily reciprocate with. And that was part of the problem and part of the rift that developed between Eric and the other and the not other comic skaters, but Eric and the comic skaters, is the fact that Eric would come on their shows and he'd get to promote his stuff on their shows, but when it came time to be like, hey, can you return the favor? His attitude was more something along the lines of, well, you're my competition. Why would I do that? And so that is the story from Ethan Van Sciver talking about this. This is one of the reasons why a rift started developing between them. Dan Elvin says, I was so excited after seeing Eric on Fox that I was trying to figure out how I was going to afford $35 cover price comic books. Yeah, that was one of the things too that, God, I'm glad y'all are here, because you're bringing in all these details that really did need to be covered. Because one of the things that was kind of phenomenal about the Rippaverse comics at the time is how much they cost. You were paying $35 for a single comic, and most people by that time, I think, in the Comicsgate sphere were charging about $20 or $25 for their comics. And everybody kind of chafed a little at the fact that the price on the book was so high. But he was basically saying, well, if this is what the market will bear, then I'm going to go ahead and charge it, which I can't argue with the business sense of that. I just, there might have been a little bit of maybe ill will generated with customers who felt like they were getting a bit ripped off in terms of price compared to what they were paying at the other places. But again, I think a lot of people were willing to pay that because this was such an ambitious venture, and it was such an ambitious venture that a lot of us wanted to see succeed. And because one of the things about a comic book universe is that the universe effect, which I've talked about a lot on my previous videos, is kind of like the rising tide lifts all boats. If somebody likes one of the comics, just even one of the comics, that's going to help the other ones sell as well. One of the companies that I miss terribly is CrossGen, which had a meta story on top of its 4 initial comic books. And because all 4 of those comic books were involved in this giant meta story involving the sigils and the sigil bearers, that I wanted to get everything that came out from that universe, because I didn't want to miss a single important detail. I think that there are a lot of fans out there like me who have an affinity for universes, because we like to have large, broad, sweeping stories from a wide variety of authors, from a wide variety of styles, that all interweave, and where the characters relate to each other, so that you have to get all of these titles so that you know what's going on. And so the Rippaverse was a very ambitious endeavor that we felt could justify the high price that we were paying, because just one copy is going to run you like $50 all total, because you're going to be paying $35 plus tax plus shipping, and now you've got $50 on your hands right there. The court says, yeah, but then he turned around and had a $5 sale on that $35 book. Yeah, well, that was the liquidation. I understand. The only reason I had a little bit of a problem with that is because I went and I bought a copy of ISOM cover C because I needed it for scans. And I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks later that he had the $5 sale. And so I kind of got burned on that, but I needed it when I needed it. So, sometimes that's just the price of doing business. So we got the books. We got the books in hand. And from the first damn page, when you open the book and you get to the first title page, it's like already there are problems. And it's not like things just went completely off the rails, but you started to see signs that maybe you were not going to get your value out of this book, because the first page was essentially blank. And by that, I mean, you had a picture of the outside of a police department with no dialogue on it, and just a picture of people walking outside, and a little blurb of text at the top that says Florispark 2 weeks ago. And immediately my critic's brain is like, what? First of all, why are we starting 2 weeks ago? Second of all, Florispark where? I think it's Florispark, Texas, because we're told that on the website, but if you don't tell us in the book, it's not canonical. So Florispark where? And then why, in God's name, when I've just paid $35 for a comic, am I seeing a basically blank page for my opener? because I want to get my money's worth out of this damn comic. I mean, I know it's got about 90 to 100 pages, but I want to see text. I want to see an explanation of where I am, or how am I supposed to be viewing things? Is somebody talking in the background? Maybe somebody inside the building is talking. And then you cut on the next page to inside a building. But here's the problem. On the first page, you don't have the police department lined up front and center. So you don't know what building you just transitioned into. And you've got a couple of guys there in green uniforms, not blue uniforms, not like blue police uniforms. They're green uniforms. Are they janitors? I mean, how do you know? You know, I don't know what to make of these guys who are in green uniforms. Are they postal workers? Are they janitors? Are they, because cops, as far as I know, wear blue. And you're in some guy's office and they're watching a TV and there's still no dialogue. Oh, Brian Suddenly Old says, I thought they were Army. Yeah, how would you know? And so I was wondering, well, are we inside the police department or are we inside of the building next to the police department? And I look at the building next to the police department and it's got this weird lettering on it that I can't make out. And I'm like, does that say florist? Does that say somebody's flowers or something? Does that say, what does that say? I had to take off my glasses and look at it and realize that it didn't say anything because it was a big smudge. I'm like, damn it, I can't even figure out what the freaking lettering on the building next to the police department says, so I guess it must be the police department where we are, but that was the only way I knew. And it turns out the reason that the lettering was smudged is because that whole building was a big 3D asset, and we'll get into that later. But the whole thing was a big 3D asset that had been tilted in such a way that the lettering on it, which actually did read the name of a flower shop, got all squinched up and snarled up and just basically blurred together. So on the very first two opening pages of ISOM number 1, I'm already looking and I'm seeing all these different problems. I'm in an office, and the office can't actually work like this in three-dimensional space. And there's other doors to this office. It's like, who the hell is this guy that he's got so many doors coming in and out of his office? That's usually, you don't see that in an office. And then he's, throwing people out of his office. Now and it turns out that this was the Mick Davies guy. If you've seen my recent clip or in my community post, this was the guy who, he's the old white guy who later got race swapped into a black guy. And, but you don't know his name. You don't get anybody's name from this first scene. You don't even get the name of the person who's supposedly back when you get this woman walking into the door saying, "Boss, she's back." And the guy's shocked. And then we cut to Silman Ranch on the outskirts of Shadow Valley, which apparently is near Florespark. You now have earlier that day. What is that supposed to mean? Because we started off 2 weeks ago, and now it says earlier that day. Does it mean earlier today? Or does it mean earlier that day 2 weeks ago? It's impossible to tell. So now you've got like an unclear timeline going on in the book. And remember, Eric July has made his business critiquing other comics, and now you're looking at his comic, and he's getting all of these things wrong. You'll have to go back and watch all of my videos if you want on ISOM number 1 to show just how much wrong there was in the book. But the fact that I was actually able to get like 11 videos out of that is a bad sign. I got at least 11, maybe 13 by the time the whole thing was done. I got a whole crap ton of videos showing all of the different problems that there were in that book. And people noticed. People didn't notice me so much because I was I mean, really, I was nobody at the time. If I'm nobody now, then boy, was I nobody back then. I only had about 100 subscribers at the time. Now I've got about 1,140. So, Rippaverse has been very good to me as far as subscribers go. Dan Alvin says 11 videos on ISOM number 1. At least. Yeah, at least 11 videos on ISOM number 1. And, by the way, when Rippaverse Trinity comes around, because I did order that volume, God, I had to order that volume. Oh, Lord, I'm so looking forward to that volume. And the reason being is because um, Eric has actually ordered that some of the artwork and such be remastered for that copy of ISOM number one. So now you're already going to have two different versions of ISOM number one. There's going to be, of course, the original versions that we all bought, and now a remastered version that's going to be in Rippaverse Trinity. I want to go through that book and actually show this is what I would have done if I had any editorial say over ISOM number one, and just go through and fix all the things that I found wrong in that. But I want to first see what it is that he thinks is now fixed, because I am willing to bet you that they broke more than they fixed. I saw what claimed to be some sample pages of, here is like some fixed artwork, and I'm looking at that and I'm like, this is worse than the first stuff. So I don't know if that was authentic or not. I'm just saying I don't have any confidence in their editorial team to even that they should even know what was wrong. But people were noticing that this was not a quality book. But try telling Eric that. And part of the problem with the people who did try telling Eric that was that they were either inclined to be or set up to be antagonists. And that's where, like, Dick Masterson comes in. So here comes Dick Masterson. And unfortunately, Dick Masterson and Vito Gesualdi, they have a podcast together called The Biggest Problem in the Universe. And they just like to savage whatever is out there. There are a couple of comedians who are like very, very caustic in their humor. And so they will basically take a subject and just beat it to death. And one of the things Dick Masterson did was say that ISOM was going to be a crap book. And like, oh, I just know it's going to be a crap book. I don't even have to read it. So he was just basically brutalizing it. And there were a lot of people who were like that online. They didn't actually read the book, and then they were nevertheless savaging the book, not having any idea what it was they were talking about. They were all just kind of feeding off, some of the negative spray that people who had actually read the book were giving online. And then you had people like Dick Masterson who was picking up on that and saying, well, this is just going to be garbage. Now, Dick actually got pushback from other podcasters saying, look, if you're going to be talking shit about ISOM number one, you need to read ISOM number one and then actually tell us what is wrong with the book. So he did. He wound up making about 100 freaking notes of things that he found wrong with ISOM number one. Now, here is where I differ from people like Ethan Van Sciver and various people who have seen Dick Masterson's notes. Dick Masterson's notes were largely shit. Eric July actually went through his notes on a live stream one at a time, and I don't know if debunk is the right words, but basically explained that all of the stuff that he was complaining about, almost all of the stuff that he was complaining about, was sheer nonsense. It was stuff that somebody could have easily just discerned from the book if he gave it more than a cursory read. They were bullshit notes, with the exception of 3 particular good ideas. Salty Traveling says, I'd argue that Masterson, in fact, did have quality feedback. You're just plain wrong. If you look at the book as it's intended to be read as part 1 of a story, you will actually see that this fits the thing that Dick Masterson was referring to, which was what he called the Save the Cat template. Save the Cat is a 13-step screenplay template that basically gives you everything that you need in order to write, a typical movie. And if you look at ISOM number 1, it goes all the way up through the first half of that Save the Cat screenplay. And what Dick Masterson's mistake was that he wanted the entire book to fit into that roadmap. And so he wanted basically ISOM number 1 to be a complete story in and of itself that would have the arcing action and then the denouement, and then you go into issue number 2. And that is not what Eric July had in mind for ISOM number 1. Now, would it have been better had Eric July planned it out that way so that there was more of a complete story to each issue of ISOM that we were getting? Yes. But considering that he's an amateur writer, this is his first comic book, and he's planning this out, and he's telling us up front, this is at least a 2-issue or 3-issue arc. We should expect that it's not going to be smooth the first time out, and that he may not adhere to what we think is the entire template. Uncapped Turtle. Okay, am I pronouncing denouement wrong? It's denouement. Fucking French people. So when Dick Masterson gave all these notes, a lot of these notes had to do with the fact that he had not, that Eric had not put forward a complete story according to that template, but he wasn't obligated to do so. Dick should have realized that, okay, we've come up to the point where we're at the halfway mark and only judge the book according to that template. Plus, there were a whole bunch of times when Dick just gave notes that were like, well, I don't understand Jasmine's motivation here. It's like, no shit, neither do we. But he's not supposed to give that out yet. Or who is this Mrs. Newman or something? It's like, it just fucking said it's Jasmine's mother. So anyway, I've got a whole video where I critique the Masterson notes. And I found that there were only 3 notes that Dick gave in that whole slew that made any sense at all. One of which I mentioned already was the whole, why do we have a 2 weeks ago? And why is it that we, when we come to the present day, we have earlier that day instead of now, which is really what was necessary. There's also another note where he talks about a particular scene where Avery Silman, ISOM, the protagonist of the book, is punching a guy in the chest. And in order to show how strong Avery is, they kind of cut to an X-ray picture of the guy where he like cracks the guy's ribs, but then the guy has like blood bursting out of his mouth or something, and it's like, okay, you just killed the guy. And obviously that's not what that was intended to be portrayed. The artist went a little overboard in putting all that together, but it was a good enough first start. That first issue should draw you in and keep you wanting more. Well, for me, it did. When I got done with ISOM number 1, and this is one of the reasons why I rated it a 6 on my 10-point scale, is that despite all of the technical problems that it had, it still had me wanting to see ISOM number 2. And if he could improve with ISOM number 2, then, things would get better. DeathFab says, yeah, because there was nothing in issue 1. See, I can't agree with that because, I know that I at least saw enough in issue number 1 where I wanted to see in issue number 2, because we still had the mystery of why is it that he quit superheroing if he was no longer a superhero. What was the deal with Jasmine? Was she actually the one behind all this stuff, or is she a pawn of Darren? How is Darren going to react to the beatdown that Avery just gave him and his staff? Is there going to be a rematch between Avery and Santuan at some point? How is that going to all fall out? There was also, of course, the little thing about Sam going into the, drawing his gun and going into the security house, and what happens to Sam after that. Then there's, of course, ALPHACORE, which is going to jump off into its own thing. There's YAIRA that's going to jump off into its own thing. So I found that ISOM number 1 was chock full of errors as far as the technical merits of the book go. But as far as being a decent story, it was good enough to at least get me to want to read ISOM number 2. But the problem was that when Eric got confronted with all of these notes that Dick had made about his book, and he was seeing just how ridiculous the majority of those were, then he was like, well, if this is what a genuine screenwriter can say about my book, then there must not actually be anything wrong with my book. And so Eric started ignoring all of the criticism. He didn't take any of the criticism, even the valid criticism that was there. He started to get this idea in his head that the only criticism you should take are from people who are on your side. And this is part of what caused another rift between Ethan Van Sciver and Eric July. That deepened the rift between them, because Ethan was of the mind that, no, everybody who your book comes in contact with is a potential resource for knowing what's right or what's wrong with the book. And if somebody's going to try and savage you about it, then maybe their advice is the advice you should listen to, especially if they have something good to say. You have to at least bring your own creative faculties and your critical faculties to their advice, but you need to be able to discern what among what they're saying, even if they hate you, even if they want your company to fail, they may still have a point. And if they have a point, you need to take that point, because if you can satisfy your worst critics, then you've improved your book enormously. And then people are just like, well, I don't care about that. I just want to see, what's the superhero origin and other bullshit like that. That's another thing that people got onto him about, was like, why can't I see his origin right away? It's like, guys, you remember like that other superhero, Batman, where they kind of left out that whole origin thing for a few issues and then finally got around to telling us. So you had this comic that dropped into everybody's hands. Clearly, it was a substandard comic. It was enough of a good start that if people had approached Eric in the beginning with the attitude of, look, we like what you're doing here, but at the same time, there's a lot of room for improvement, instead of his being told this is a crap book over and over and over again, then, especially by people who hadn't read it, and then being given like crap notes by somebody who was supposed to be a respected person in the industry, then why would he ever take criticism after that? And in fact, he started a particular show on his podcast called Monetize Your Haters. At which point you could have just seen the fact that, number one, people were going to come on and they were just going to be haters. They weren't going to be actual rational critics of the book. He wasn't expecting them to be that. And so he wasn't going to be taking any of the advice that they were giving them. And I know, because I was one of the freaking haters that he monetized. I got on the show and I was basically going through the book and pointing these things out one at a time to him. And some of them, he just freaking tried to gaslight me on. It's like, holy crap, when I basically said, look, it's clear that the emphasis on this word should have been placed on this word. He's like, no, I meant it all to be that way. I'm like, dude, it's a freaking lettering mistake. It happens, okay? You can just admit that it happened, but he wouldn't. And at that point, I knew, when I probably should have known from even earlier than that he was not going to take anything that anybody said as criticism. He had basically, what, if you want to put it in biblical terms, hardened his heart against anybody's advice at that point, and he was just going to go on and do whatever it was he was going to do. There was like nothing anybody could say, even down to the smallest little thing of, this word was bolded wrong, or here of course was one thing that I got famous for, was telling him this truck is the wrong color. There's a scene in ISOM number 1 where a kid gets into a truck and the truck is colored like the truck that this other guy had driven up in, but he's actually in someone else's truck. So I'm like, when you have the kid get into a truck that's the wrong color, you make it think like he's going off with this guy instead of that guy. And he tried to give me some bullshit about, well, it's just part of a fleet of trucks and they're all colored the same thing. And I'm just like, no, we see the other guy's truck later in the book and it's not that color. So I'm waiting to see if this new updated version of ISOM number 1 that's going to come out in that Rippaverse Trinity has that fixed. I bet it won't, but I'm going to see. If they do fix the truck color, I'm going to be amazed. And so he just got kind of solidified, like, listening to the echo chamber that was all of his positive fans, all of the people who really didn't know what the hell they were talking about and just praised him to the heavens, and he accepted that and thought that whatever it was that he wrote was going to be the shit after that. And that was the infuriating thing. That was the disheartening thing. That was the thing that drove us fans crazy, to the point where, some people just decided, okay, from now on, I'm just going to try and do everything I can to tear him down. Now, I would still like to see the books. Well, was going to say I would still like to see the books get better, but I tell you what, I mean, I've had so much disappointment with like every single freaking book that has come out of that freaking company that I just don't have the confidence anymore. But getting back to that time, we still had confidence, and ISOM number 2 still could have been a comparative masterpiece. Because who knows? Maybe some of the critique would have gotten through. Maybe Eric would have listened to some of the advice and allowed that to season him as a writer. But I think a couple of things happened, and I can't really say this for sure, but I think when he saw the response, not just to ISOM, the positive response among his fans, because of course there was positive response as well as negative response. I mean, there was negative response from his critics and such, but there's an overwhelming positive response from his fans who absolutely were curious to see more about YAIRA and ALPHACORE and all these, and of course Norfolka, who is the bonus reveal of that. And people wanted to see more of these characters. And when he realized that the more characters he put into the book, the more interest he could generate in more of his properties. I don't know this, but I kind of suspect that he kind of jiggered around his plot lines so that he could introduce more characters up front. And that's how we got Bloodruth and Gooding in issue number 2 of ISOM. Issue number 2 of ISOM, I just expected to be, and I think a lot of us just expected to be, the Darren gets revenge issue. You know, ISOM had just gone to Darren's club, torn it up, and blah, blah, blah. And now Darren was going to get his revenge and come after ISOM, come after his sister, and ISOM was going to have to get back into the superheroing business. And that was basically where issue 2 was going to go. That was the logical progression. But then ISOM number 2 came out, and the sales for that were a stunning comparative failure. They were a stunning comparative failure. Now, it was still about $2.3 million, I want to say. So it's not like he failed. It's not like the company was going to go out of business after that, or that was even in trouble after that. But that was nowhere near what he had made before. And it was nowhere near what people expected him to make, because especially me, I thought he might make about 3.2. He lost half of his readership. His purchaser count went down from about 45,000 to 23,000. That was a massive, massive hit. When ISOM number 2 hit and we saw that the number of subscribers had dropped to 23,000, we were like, oh my God. Because I was in no way expecting that many people would have given up on the book just like that. And part of it may have been just the fact that people, there may have been a lot of speculators in the initial market for ISOM number 1. It was first comic of a startup comic book company. People may have just gone in thinking, hey, I'll go ahead and get this first issue, and then I'll just blow off the second issue. That may be one explanation. But another explanation is they just didn't really like what they saw in the first issue. And a lot of people tried to explain it away, saying, well, this happens with every comic. You get the first number 1 comic out on the rack, and then the number 2 comic is going to do half as well. But Ethan Van Sciver ably brushed off that kind of excuse, because what's happening in the retail market, when you go to the comic book store and you see a comic that's on the rack, that comic was actually purchased by the retailer like 3 months ago. And so the retailer has no idea when the next issue, which was solicited 2 months ago, the retailer doesn't even know how the first issue sold. And so he has to assume that there's not going to be as much interest in the second issue as there was in the first. And so he just naturally cuts the orders in half. Now, that's natural for a retailer's market. But when you're dealing with independent comics, you're not going through a retailer. You're just connecting directly with the people who are producing the book. It's a direct sale. So if people like your book, they're going to get your book again. There's not just going to be this natural drop-off. It's only going to be a natural drop-off if people naturally don't like your book. So the fact that ISOM number 1 dropped so hard to ISOM number 2 was really, really a clarion call to worry, to worry. Um, People were then starting to wonder, what's it going to be like by the time ISOM number 3 comes out, because ISOM number 2 was a freaking disaster compared to ISOM number 1. When you looked at ISOM number 2 and you saw the quality of the writing in that book, it was so much worse that people were like, what are what? You had all of these people out there giving you criticism, and then you produce worse work than your first volume. How does that happen? You've got a story that is going all freaking over the place. You got a story that starts off in the worst way possible, with Isom's sister unidentified in an walking in a hallway in a building we don't know. No, there's nothing to introduce her. And then she walks into her office and Darren's sitting right there, and he's still not named. He's named Darren, but you still don't even know his last name. And you won't know it until close to the end of ISOM number 2. Can you imagine that? You have a comic book with a clear hero and a clear villain, and you never mention the villain's last name until the last section of your second issue. What? And then we get introduced to the girl's boss, who grows different facial hair on every page. That's how great the artwork was in that second book. And then we go to Avery having a therapy lesson with his tailor. The guy who's making his costume is the guy who's giving him psychological advice about why he quit the superheroing business so many years ago. And not only does the superheroing advice, the advice that he gives Avery make no sense, but even what happened in the past, the introduction of this monster Shadron, why we even know his name, we don't know, because, he's given the name on the page. Altona, Avery's sister Altona couldn't even be identified on the page, but we know Shadron's name because why? And this monster kills a girl in front of him, and that's just enough reason for him to up and quit. There's no real psychology going on with this book. I mean, we were supposed to be given the mystery and the revelation of why it was that Avery had quit the superheroing business, and then it was like something that a 5-year-old could have put together. And then Avery goes back to his farm, and his farm is now being attacked by these things called hellions or devilings, and where the fuck do they even come from? What is this? Why is he not dealing with, like, Darren's henchman setting his place on fire? Why are we dealing with hellions and devilings now? Well, it's because we need to bring Bloodruth into it somehow, and we're going to do that by way of Gooding, who's going to come in and put out the fire, because he charges people a nominal fee for coming in and putting out fires. If all of this sounds fucking stupid, it is. And so by the time you get to the end of ISOM number 2, you're like, I don't know where the fuck this company is going. And then, of course, he also lands in the middle of his trademark dispute with the International School of Ministry. And that's when things really go south, because now we have no idea when ISOM number 3 is going to come out. First, they've got to settle this whole, International School of Ministry thing with whatever consequences are going to come out of that. Andrew Rowland says, this makes me believe that ISOM 1 and 3 are the actual ill-advised arc. That's what I think, too. And I could be wrong. I mean, I've been wrong about other things. I was definitely wrong about thinking that Mike Barron had originally turned in a 96-page script that the Rippaverse editors had cut in half and then blown up. That turned out not to be the case. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it past Eric to have rearranged his story so that he could introduce Gooding and Bloodruth earlier, so that he could launch those characters earlier. Fan art exhibit says Eric expects people to simply stick around instead of him earning the right for his stories to be further read by the audience. And there is a core audience of his that is sticking around. There's probably a good 1,000, 2,000 or so people out there who are still buying a whole bunch of his stuff. Is that going to be enough to sustain the comic going forward, or the comic book company going forward? Possibly, depending on how much stuff he's able to crank out, because I think that's basically what he's trying to do, is start cranking out enough books in enough mass amounts that he's able to keep the company afloat. But at least until some studio whale or something sees the properties and says, oh, I can turn this into a movie, and then hopefully he'll be set. So when ISOM number 2 came out, it was like, okay, so I guess nothing we say is possibly going to make this company any better. So why should we stick around? And sure enough, when ALPHACORE came out, ALPHACORE not even being written by Eric July, but was actually written by Chuck Dixon and drawn by Joe Bennett. They lost half of their readership on that one too. They went down on that one from, I think, about 23,000 to about 11,000 purchasers. And that may have been the last time that they started reporting on purchasers, because I think they realized what an embarrassment that was. I mean, they were down to a quarter of their original audience after just 2 books. It was just incredibly freaking sad. This is from Fan Art Exhibit. YAIRA 2 sales are at 242,000 only. His business is unsustainable at this level. It's looking like, 242,000 for the number 2, but and the first one, YAIRA was another. YAIRA was a partial flop in that everybody expected it to do better than ALPHACORE, and it was soon becoming clear that it was not going to do as well as ALPHACORE, or it would only just barely get there. Everybody expected YAIRA number 1 to do 1.5 million, and the only way that he managed to get there was by dropping that McFarlane Toys statue of YAIRA. And the statue sales bumped up the campaign so that he could claim a 1.5 million finish for YAIRA number 1. Yeah, it was Fan Art Exhibit mentions the word mammoth. That was supposed to be his mammoth character. That was going to be their mammoth campaign, and it fell about as tepid as ALPHACORE did. And then, of course, we got ALPHACORE, which was written by Chuck Dixon. So the writing quality kind of had a better baseline to it than Eric's did, but it still wasn't A-game material. And I think I could safely say that because there were certain rules that were broken just in the internal logic of the book. You had a villain whose desire was to stay concealed and safe from ALPHACORE, and instead she goes and does like the thing that's going to make them want to pursue her even more. And then you have another character who's basically told, yes, you're a power level 2 person now, but if you train hard enough, you can get your powers up to speed. And instead, he is able to burn himself out completely at level 10 the next day with no training. So it's not an internally consistent book. It's not an externally consistent book because the characters of Brian Solari, Ingrid Valdez, Braxwell is Braxwell. He never talks. He rarely ever talks, so you don't know anything about him anyway. But Brian Solari and Ingrid Valdez, who have already been portrayed in ISOM number 2 for a very brief segment, sound nothing like they did there, and will sound nothing like they did again in YAIRA number 1. And then you've got the characters of Lillian Renashi and Michael Copper, and they kind of neither look nor sound. Lillian looks about the same and sounds about the same, but Michael Copper neither looks nor sounds like he did in ISOM number 1. So there's extraordinary incompetence when it comes to having these characters speak with a consistent voice. And so people are seeing another flaw in the system adding up already. And then came Gooding the Polymath. Now, by this time, by the way, things between Eric July and Ethan Van Sciver had just gone completely south. And the reason for that was, and let me just give kind of the best explanation that I can in a short amount of time as I can. Ethan tried to be positive toward Eric July at the very beginning. He even drew a cover for ISOM number 2, and it turned out to be their best-selling cover, although it only sold slightly more than the A cover that he was really competing with. And he tried to be positive. He tried to be helpful. But he also knew that there were problems with ISOM number 1 and with ISOM number 2. And at some point, Eric July contacted him via text, and Ethan does not like to be contacted via text, for one thing, basically saying that, you need to stop giving a platform to the people who are against me. or else I am no longer going to block people who are against you from my platform. So Ethan took that to be a threat, and for a while he said, "Okay, well, let's just come to an agreement and bury the whole thing." But he always chafed under that. And for several months he chafed under the fact that he had kind of knuckled under before Eric July's threat, knowing that Eric was, had the bigger customer base and could potentially sabotage Ethan's customer base. Uh, and so he held on to his anger until Eric was just basically outright denying certain things that Ethan said, but that Ethan said he had the receipts for. And so Ethan dumped some texts online that showed the conflict between the two of them. And at that point, any kind of alliance between Rippaverse and Comicsgate was pretty much over. There would still be a couple of Comicsgate artists who would do things for and writers who would do things for Eric. I mean, Mike Barron, of course, is writing Gooding the Polymath, and he'll be writing the upcoming Gooding series, as well as a new series called Delta Base. And you had Graham Nolan, who I think he did the special cover of YAIRA #1. And so you still have some interactions with between comic skaters and the Rippaverse, but it's a very, very carefully parceled, carefully separated set of domains at this point. I mean, there's people who are welcome in both spheres, and then there are other people who are just basically not caring to associate in those directions at all. Moreover, Eric July started issuing kind of attacks on the crowdfunding system that underlies all of Comicsgate's work by saying that there were artists who were taking advantage of the fans and not delivering products in a timely fashion. Now, of course, the crowdfunding basis is I'm giving you the money in the hopes that you will take this to produce a product worthy of the money. So take as long as you need. Just keep me informed. That's the basic agreement between somebody who donates to crowdfunding and somebody who is the artist who wants to create a product for the people that he's crowdfunding. So when Eric July came down on that, definitely soured Shane Davis toward him. And Shane had also drawn a cover for him at that point. He did the cover for ISOM #2, the special foil cover. And it resonated as an attack on the business model of independent comic publishers who don't have, the storehouse of money that Eric July had when starting his company. So that created even more bad blood amongst the two sectors, the Rippaverse sector and the Comicsgate sector. So that was going on at the same time, and Ethan wound up, eventually falling out with Yellow Flash, who basically stabbed Ethan in the back by revealing Ethan's friends cover rate, and also by deleting a forum that was used by comic skaters. And so Ethan started up Trashcast versus Yellow Flash's Flashcast as a competing live stream where he could just basically make fun of Eric July and do that, which is only served really to make Eric even more hard against criticism, because now he's getting it on the regular from Eric July and a bunch of people who are kind of dedicated detractors and who are watching Eric July's streams and kind of monitoring everything he does. Of course, you've got Katydid, who provides a lot of snips and clips from various live streams. You've got BTM Reviews, who has kind of gathered around himself a bunch of people who are not fans of Eric July, and I've appeared on his live stream sometimes. So you've got a whole bunch of people out there who have really, Frog Tony's another one, who have kind of made it their business to give Eric July the business And I don't really consider myself that much among them because I try to keep myself to just basically critiquing the comics and occasionally making Eric July or anybody else aware of the problems in the comics, like I did recently on the Rip and Silverback show, where I was able to inform Eric about the race swapping and age swapping, occupation swapping of one of the characters that he created that occurred in Horseman #1. I don't know if there'll be a sequel to that, but it's tempting. We'll see how many streams I can get banned from. I mean, hey, it was a super chat. Just take my money. Dan Alvin says giving ultimatums to a guy from Jersey sometimes has unintended consequences. Well, I know it's been lucrative for Ethan Van Sciver because I know that he funds his family outings off of the trash casts, and so a lot of people give him a lot of super chats. Eccentric says, but at least the YAIRA trailer gave critics endless hours of entertainment. Oh yes. Oh God. Oh, my mind's eye just got stabbed with memories of the YAIRA #1 live action trailer. I mean, that was something nobody was expecting, and it was just the most laughable thing you can imagine. I mean, you watch that trailer and you're just like, no, I'm not really seeing this. I'm not really watching this, am I? This is not real. This is not real. I'm dreaming. I'm dreaming I'm watching one of the worst live action comics trailers that has ever been produced. Oh God, I've got a video on that too, so feel free to look it up. But yes, at the beginning of the YAIRA #1 campaign, Eric July released a live action YAIRA trailer featuring a large blonde woman with a horrific fake accent and special effects that kind of barely resembled the action that would be taking place in the comic. That did not set people up with a good feeling toward YAIRA #1. I think I was at Gooding in the history of the Rippaverse, and Gooding, god damn, that thing just broke me. I mean, that was the comic where I was just like, you know what? I don't have any confidence in this company at all anymore because I could not believe how bad that comic was. I mean, it's almost was like it was written stream of consciousness in one take with no revisions going back to actually try and make it, structurally sound. That's all I can think of at this point because there's like I've shown in one of my videos. I mean, 25% of the book is just bloat. You can get rid of 25% of the book and still have the same book. And that's not the kind of stuff that you really want to see in one of your comics. Brian Sunleal, Mike needs a good editor to make his projects sing. Check out Bronze Star. I've heard about Bronze Star, and I will be looking at his next Sherlock Holmes book that's coming out. The one with Sherlock Holmes and Captain Nemo. I've got that on order. Brian Sunleal says he has a good editor on Sherlock, and that really is. You're bringing up a really good point here. Editing is so important. If it, that every single independent comic book publisher out there ought to know that by now. And it is kind of surprising that they don't have more people out there who are willing to step in and edit. And it's funny. I was at a happy hour. I was mentioning I was at a happy hour the other day, and somebody asked me. He says, well, if you could retire tomorrow, what would you do? And I said I would create a company that would edit comics. I would basically offer my services as a comic book editor to any of the companies out there that would need it, any of the independent publishers and such who needed someone to look over their plots, look over their scripts, look over their pencils, their inks, their colors, whatever the finished book. I'm not sure how much, I could really contribute in some of those areas. I'm not like an expert colorist or anything like that. But if you needed help in that way, then I could possibly provide help for a fee. Or maybe I can put you on a subscription plan for $49.99 a month, like Gooding. Uh, but that's probably what I would do, because what I really see out there is a lot of people with a lot of talent who don't know either when to kind of, step back and let the comic breathe a little, or maybe they need to invest more of themselves into the comic in order to get it up to the standard that it needs to be. That would probably be a kind of one of those fun, here's how I coast out the rest of my days kind of business. Brian Suddenly Old, I think the editors at the Rippaverse were intimidated by the talent EJ hired. I mean, that's entirely possible, but it just depends on how much confidence they have on themselves as well. I mean, and also just how much talent they have for this kind of stuff. Because I mean, think about this. Think about the fact that you have this character, Mick Davies, old white guy. He's featured prominently in ISOM #1. He's in one panel of YAIRA #1. And here comes Horseman #1. And how many editors does Horseman #1 have? You've got the Soska sisters who have to make sure they have to read it over in order to maintain the lore. You've got whoever was the lead editor on that book to begin with. I don't know who that was. I want to say Andrew, but I could be wrong about that. You should have Eric July himself, who created the character Mick Davies, and you would think that any one of them would notice, hey, I thought he was a white guy and he's black here. I mean, when you've got at least 4 other sets of eyes on the book, don't you think one of them is going to catch the fact that your white character is now black and demoted? It just pains me to think of all of the stuff that they let through that gets into readers' hands and makes the reader just say, what the fuck is this? Even when it comes down to just regular typos. I mean, I've seen like text on the back of some of these Rippaverse books where you see 2 words stuck together, like the space between them was left out. It doesn't take much to read the goddamn back matter of your own book. How do you do that? How do you let that go through? I really wonder if one of the reasons why Eric July has hired this woman Gothix to do his public relations for him is so that he can pay more attention to his editorial duties as editor-in-chief of Rippaverse Comics, because somebody needs to. Obviously, the people who they've currently got are just not cutting the mustard. I mean, that's kind of what I would love to send in another super chat out there and just basically say, okay, so you've said that Mick Davies is the old white police chief from ISOM #1 and YAIRA #1, but on his character page on your website, you say that he's a detective who's Callie Briggs' partner, and then we see in Horseman #1 that Callie Briggs' partner, Mick Davies, is a young black man. So who's right, and how much are you paying the Soska sisters to keep all this straight? They are the lore keepers, right? Puma Fist, July's books lack talent all around. I don't really agree with that, because like one of the things we were talking about, the 3D assets, and this was another scandal that affected Rippaverse for a while, although I never really felt it should have been as scandalous as it was. People began to detect that artist Cliff Richards was using a program called SketchUp and was taking objects from the computer, and instead of having to draw these objects by hand himself, all he had to do was lay down the object and use the computer to rotate it into the particular position it needed to be. And this could be humans, this could be trucks, this could be buildings, it could be really anything. Then he could kind of put a filter over it to make it look as though it had been hand-drawn. People noticed that to the extent that so much in ISOM #1 and ISOM #2 fit this. They were even able to match the 3D objects he had used in other comic books that he had drawn to what was being used in ISOM #1. In fact, there was a hilarious scene that somebody managed to pull out of another Cliff Richards drawn book where the house interior matched the house interior in ISOM number 2, right down to the couch the characters were sitting on. So people were saying that, this was lazy, this was not, for one thing, this was not what Eric was paying for. But my feeling about the use of 3D objects has always been, whatever shortcut techniques you want to take and still tell the story in a good and concise and believable and understandable way, knock yourself out. I mean, I really could care less whether the objects had to be drawn by you with feeling or with gusto or with whatever the hell it is that drawing it by hand is supposed to accomplish. If you're drawing a truck, I don't really care about the truck so much as the fact of where's the truck going, where's the character going. It's like what are we doing in this scene? As opposed to how did this truck get on the page? That doesn't really matter so much to me. In fact, there's a sequence in ISOM number 2 that's by Cliff Richards, and I'm sure that 3D assets were used throughout the scene, but it's so clear what it is he's communicating, and it has to be because Eric July didn't provide any dialogue for any of those scenes, that he tells the story just silently with his artwork alone, and it's pretty great. Honestly, if I wanted to hire somebody and, I had a choice between, Cliff Richards and some unknown, I'd probably take Cliff Richards and say, hey, you want to use SketchUp, knock yourself out. Just make sure it's at least as good as the sequences that I've seen him draw. Dan Alvin says the endless labyrinth of generic office spaces and boilerplate architecture in general really ebbed my interest immediately. I'm a devotee of elaborate, meticulous background details, LOL. Yeah, the thing about 3D objects in ISOM number 2, I mean, there was a good sequence of that, but there was also a bad sequence of that, and it was where Avery is remembering the experience with the kids that he was trying to protect from Shadron. And you'll notice he's at a comic book convention where Shadron has apparently been on a rampage, and there's all of this stuff strewn around, but there are no bodies anywhere. And I'm looking around and I'm like, where are all the dead people? Shouldn't there be corpses here? It's almost like the, Independence Day where you had all the burned out cars, but you had no corpses in any of the cars. I'm looking at this page and I'm like, yeah, I mean, everybody cut and run, but you think Shadron would have gotten at least one more or two more and thrown them around in like various splayed angles or something? The kids mentioned that he killed a cop, and it's like, you don't see the cop's body anywhere. You don't see any bodies anywhere. You just see the 2 kids in there. It's like, did he eat them all? What the hell? You've got this guy who's apparently on a murderous rampage, and there's only one murder so far. That to me was kind of a disappointment because I could kind of tell that probably Cliff Richards had just kind of backed off on that and saying, well, he didn't ask for any bodies, so I'm not giving any bodies. And yet it would have been the thing that made the most sense. Karate Stick, Larry Shungite. Yeah, if anybody doesn't know, in ISOM number 2, there's a scene where for no freaking reason we cut to this wrestling arena. And these guys are talking about this wrestling league. And the only reason that this thing is even in the book is because so many people asked about the Southern or the Southwest Southern Wrestling League or something like that, was mentioned at the end of ISOM number 1. I guess a whole bunch of people wrote in and said, there's a wrestling league? What is that all about? And so Eric July actually wrote a scene where one of his characters is watching on TV this big wrestling scene where this guy named Larry Shungite comes out. And of course, there's a splash page where everybody's, cheering as his, startup symbols appear. There's like a hammer and anvil thing going on. But he's not on the stage yet. So this whole splash page is just kind of wasted on, nobody there. And then he comes out and he spends like half the entire page just getting up to the stage, quiet and all. Nobody's saying anything. And he grabs the microphone and he starts talking about how the title was robbed from him and how he wants to get the title back from the winner. And then the winner's right about to come out, and then they cut away, and they never show you who the winner was. And I'm just like, why am I even watching this? And then the guy's like, well, sir, it's time to go. You need to get down to the car. And so they both leave. I'm like, where does this even come from? Why did we have that thrown in there for just no freaking reason? And again, who knows? I think at one point Eric July was actually in talks with a pro wrestler to write a wrestling style comic book, and maybe that fell through. But uh, who knows? We may actually see a comic book about Larry Shungite someday. So where does Rippaverse stand now? Well, of course, Rippaverse. Oh, well, I think, let's see. I was on Gooding, and now Horseman has kind of been a bounce back from the financial disaster that was Gooding. Gooding only made about $500,000, if that. And now it's looking like YAIRA #2 is only going to hit about what, 300,000. So they're having to put forward considerably more. It seems like they're having to put forward more effort in order to sustain their numbers. Because when you think about it, if YAIRA #2 gets $300,000, and YAIRA #1, which was probably twice as long, got 1 point something million dollars. I mean, that's a hell of a drop. And now you have to start creating more comics and more comics just to keep the business afloat. I don't know how long they're going to be able to sustain that, especially if their quality doesn't rise to the challenge. I mean, the state of things presently is that Eric stands to come out with a slew of books in 2025. And this first year of such mass production of books is really going to kind of set a benchmark for what Rippaverse quality is going to look like going forward. Is it going to be the same low quality that we've been experiencing over and over again? Or are things actually going to get better? I would submit that without editorial control, you're not going to see better comics out of them. It's going to depend entirely on the writers who really have no motivation to really put forward their best effort. And what will have to happen at some point is somebody's got to realize, there's probably going to be some higher profile fans that just basically say, I like the Rippaverse at first, but honestly, the quality is just not up to snuff. I can see it now and I'm getting out. And then that could potentially start a cascade that brings everybody out. Fan art exhibit says YAIRA will struggle to hit 400,000. I feel. I think Chris Bacon said YAIRA 2 was a complete failure relative to book 1. So far, it is. I mean, because book 1 hit about 1.2 million before they did the statue drop that raised everything to 1.5 million. So I would say 1.2 million. Yeah, I mean, it's only making between a fifth and a sixth of what it made before. It's a pittance financially, but how many people did not go from YAIRA #1 to #2? That's really what I'd love to know. Fan art exhibit said, I'm convinced Eric has talked himself into believing things are better than they are. Well, part of the thing is it's hard to gauge how things are. And if his writers start to depart, that's when there's going to be a problem. If Mike Barron decides he's got better things to do, if Chuck Dixon decides he's got better things to do, if the Soska sisters decide they've got better things to do, there's going to be trouble, because if you can't keep the writers, then something is not right in the state of Denmark. Brian Suddenly Old, Dixon's favorite thing about the Rippaverse is Eric pays on time. That was a direct quote from an interview about the Rippaverse from an outside interviewer. Yeah, I think he even had that in his dedication page. Brian Suddenly Old also says, EJ pays writers really well from the scuttlebutt I've heard in the YouTube chats. Yeah, pays them well, pays them on time. So, yeah, I mean, if something were to happen there where he wasn't able to pay and retain his writers, that's when you can see the writing on the wall, I would say. But that's probably kind of far off, because, Chuck Dixon is going to be writing a bunch of stuff. The Soskas are writing their own individual titles now. They're going to be, let's see what else. Mike Barron's slated to do more. So I think there's a lot of work on all of their plates. But as far as whether the company is, on the verge of folding or not, I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. He's got such big plans for this next year that I would almost hate to see things fall apart before he at least gets to go through most of what he's got planned. Now, of course, if the company were to collapse before Salvage PI and Sersha #1 came out, I'd be fine with that. Okay, well, I hope that kind of gives kind of an outline of where things got to with the Rippaverse from its beginnings to here. I mean, I'm sure I left out a ton of stuff, and you know, feel free in the comments to fill in any details that I might have missed, and or if you have any contradictions that you want to load in, or things that I got wrong, or just opinions that you've got, feel free to put those in the comments. So thanks to everyone who has been holding on and watching. I hope this provided a generally good history lesson on what all went on with the Riververse, and especially from the reader's point of view of how we felt about it at the time. Thanks to everyone for sticking around, and I'm Mike Partika. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and if you find any money, feel free to drop a super thanks after the chat has ended, and we'll get even closer to that $50 goal for YAIRA #2, and I will talk to you all later.